First of all, I want to start off by saying thank you to everyone who watched the other two videos about Shadow Man. I had a lot of fun playing these games and making these videos, which was honestly my focus when I first purchased a device to capture game footage. Looking back, I made some grave mistakes in these videos, such as overlooking important elements, giving outright incorrect information, and disregarding the plots of both games almost entirely. I didn't even try to remove myself from the perspective of a nearly lifelong fan of the series to try and offer a more welcoming and informative perspective. I'm also not happy with the overall quality of those videos, especially the writing and voiceover. I hope to rectify these issues with 2 new videos on the series, starting with the sequel. Why start with the sequel? Well, console players of Shadow Man Remastered are still awaiting a patch with new features, game modes, and bosses, so I cannot yet offer a complete definitive review. I think it's relatively safe to say the sequel won't be getting a remaster, as all of the source code and assets have been lost. That, and almost no one seems to like it. A recent leak of prototype builds make me slightly hopeful a remaster, or maybe even some mods, but probably not, so even though I hope I'm wrong, this game is likely going to stay a PS2 exclusive, so this could be the definitive review. I remember the first time I ever played this game, very clearly actually. Summer 2003, and I rented it from Blockbuster and stayed up all night playing it in the living room while my then stepbrother was playing something on his PS1 with the little screen attached. I didn't even know Shadow Man had a sequel until I stumbled upon the name in some magazine I was reading at the store one day. I wasn't sure if I was ever going to talk about this game again, but I wanted to expand upon my thoughts as my last video was clearly biased and specifically written to defend it. Initially, I intended to beat this game exactly as intended by the Prima strategy guide and make a video about that, but this one isn't really open enough for that to have been an engaging video. I guess the only option left is a full review. I'll get this out of the way first. I have a soft spot for this game. I love it, but I will, however, attempt to stay as objective as possible. For this one, we have a rare opportunity to see this game in various stages of development and even read the original script. Thanks to the efforts and data mining skills of Carrot, we are also able to see some of the cut content as it existed at its latest point in development, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm not sure exactly when development began or how long the development cycle was, but the game was clearly not ready for release when it was published on February 28, 2002. Reviews on this game are mixed, with some being more forgiving and some being pretty harsh, but the overwhelming opinion within the fan community seems to be that this game isn't terrible on its own, but does not deliver as a sequel to the beloved Shadow Man, released in 1999. Sadly, even as a fan of this game, I have to agree, and I'll take it even a step further. If this game didn't have Shadow Man in it, I doubt anyone would have ever played it or even knew it existed. If I was to see footage of this game and the character was new to me, I don't think I'd be compelled to play it. Second Coming suffers from a long list of technical issues and bugs ranging from frequent frame drops, camera issues, excessive loading times, textures missing entirely from levels, and a boatload of other things that will annoy you once or twice during a playthrough. There's also an intangible sense of incompletion here, but more on that later. A quick glance at the credits between the two games will reveal that several people from the first game were on board for the sequel, which could be somewhat surprising given the sudden shift in tone and atmosphere. For example, every person credited for character animation in the original game has the same job this time around. One of the 3 lead artists from the first game has kept this position for the sequel, and the other 2, who were lead artists, are still on the books as level artists. One of the character artists has made a return, and it appears that several people either received promotions or transfers in the meantime. You will, however, notice that not many of the names are the same on the more administrative side of the credits. Acclaim was going through an insane amount of drama behind the scenes, stateside and elsewhere. They needed money, which is why the game remains a PS2 exclusive. Sony was willing to pay more for the exclusive. I had once heard a rumor that Second Coming's commercial shortcomings is what put Acclaim out of business. This is not exactly true, but it's likely not too far off either. I doubt we'll ever know the real sales figures, but it was underwhelming enough to lead to the closure of its development studio, which had technically been around since 1988 at that point. The company was pulling insane stunts with their marketing at the time, and Second Coming is far from the sole reason Acclaim was having issues, but I can't imagine it helped when this game released to very little fanfare. The 2 brothers who founded what would become Acclaim Studios' T-Side, Director of Product Development Jason Falkus and Managing Director Darren Falkus, had already left the company in 2000 to form Atomic Planet Entertainment. Not helping matters is that 3 of the key members of the development of the first game, Creative Director Guy Miller, Senior Designer Simon Phipps, and Composer/Audio Engineer Tim Haywood, had all left Acclaim during the development of this title. Haywood, composer and audio engineer for the first game and sound director for the sequel, quit because of the changes happening to the game and went on to Microsoft. Miller and Phipps moved on to Electronic Arts, where they would work on the Harry Potter games, and that covers a little bit of the background dysfunction, which is definitely reflected in the final product, as I mentioned before. Within just the first few pages of the script, we see levels, characters, cutscenes, storylines, weapons, context-sensitive items, and more that would be removed before release. It's pretty evident that the game that was ultimately published is pretty far removed from what Simon Phipps had intended when he wrote the script. In fact, in the original script, the opening cutscene makes reference to a level and a character that we never actually encounter in-game, save from his random appearance in the ceiling for some reason. Initially, the player would have been introduced to Michael reading a newspaper riding a train. He would then transform into Shadow Man, the glow from his mask being the sole light source around him, but interestingly, the script makes mention of a train guard approaching Shadow Man to inform him that they are arriving in New Orleans, and from the perspective of the guard, he is Mike in human form. That's a really interesting idea. The aforementioned newspaper, the National Inquisitor, was intended to serve a purpose similar to Nettie's file and Shadow Man. It was supposed to reference the intended story beats, making reference to a mysterious star, a feature by a TV evangelist that would serve to, quote, familiarize the player with the backstory, quote, an X-Files style investigation into the legend of the Baba Yaga and the mysterious dark witch said to haunt the forests of northern Russia. There's a feature on the chalice, and there are phone numbers that were intended to be called from the payphone inside the Wild at Heart, and even possible advertisement for Acclaim's upcoming projects, which is a very interesting sentence to speak out loud in 2022. The game was intended to start with the ambush at the Wild at Heart, similar to what happens in the final game after you have left Deadside. Nettie was intended to be your voodoo weapons dealer. Not joking. And side note, the opening and the overall tone of the game draws heavily on its comic roots, but we'll discuss that later. There are several more major differences, such as the armor of angels, but that's enough about the script for now. I just wanted to use it as an example of how much the initial vision seems to have been lost in translation. There is much more to discuss, so check the description for a link to Carrot250's channel on YouTube. He has posted a good amount of cut content from both games and intends to make more videos about them. To give credit where it's due, the game seemed to be in pretty good hands as of the June 2001 prototype, which is currently the earliest playable build that we have. Before really diving into any of the beta content, as a disclaimer, I have only played 3 of these releases: June 5th, November 8th, and November 28th. The following footage is made up of gameplay from all 3 of these versions, and link in the description if you want to try these yourself. There are a few other builds I have not played. Back to it, the level designs here are very similar, and in many cases the exact same as those found in the retail release. The November 28 build, exactly 3 months before release, does not feature the final HUD design and does not contain one of the game's greatest innovations: 2 assignable weapon slots per hand. I had a lot of fun with the free camera mode as I explored Ireland to get a feel for the level without the checkerboard glitch.
Oh yeah?
Second Coming sound director Tim Haywood has stated that there was a more polished version of the game, but for unknown reasons, this build of the game was ultimately never published. Sad thing is, none of that matters. No amount of good intention can fix an ultimately broken and incomplete product. Alright, so we're going to look at the strategy guide, and unlike the first game, the different regions actually have different box art. The manuals are basically the exact same, only in the PAL regions are you actually instructed to look for this game. I guess that's why I never looked for that game. Like, over here, I was never told to. So in the back of the NTSC booklet, you actually have this survey you could fill out and send back in the day, and then this picture of Mike Lavoie, and you also have a notes section. They don't actually have the notes page or the fold out, I guess that's a postcard, and they have a different image of Mike and Shadow Man. That's the only difference in the booklets, and the disc art is different. Over here, the disc art matches basically everything else, plus the spine actually matches. They have a different disc, which still shows the difference between Mike and Shadow Man, but in PAL regions, I don't know if you've seen their games, but they all look like this on PS2. If I'm not mistaken, I don't know, this is the only one that I have, but I think they're all white spine with plain text. I wanted to point out something that I noticed in here. So about Jaunty, this says that he has one bulging eye, which he doesn't. Grease-stained white t-shirt, that's not a t-shirt, and adorned with voodoo necklaces. He's not wearing any voodoo necklaces. But if you look in the manual, you can see that his eye is bulging there. But when I went back to look in the game, I didn't notice it either. So just like the game, this This strategy guide is a lot lighter than the one from the first time around. It actually ends right at the end of the game. There's no interviews, no behind the scenes anything, no even advertisements for anything else. It's pretty insane to see that actually. The last page is the last page. I like having this, but I wouldn't suggest buying it unless you love the game. The game's so linear, you don't really need this thing anyway. You're not gonna miss anything. What we got is a third-person action-adventure platformer with an emphasis on exploration, collectibles, and puzzles. You control Mike Loa and or his alter ego Shadow Man as you explore a total of 6 levels, spending most of your time in live side this time around. Combat is given a huge facelift since the first game, and while not even close to perfect, I prefer this combat system over the 1999 original. This game is far more rooted in fantasy and action than its predecessor, and the horror is toned down considerably here, which clashes with a more edgy attitude given to each of the characters.
I reckon I need to go bust a cap in this guy's ass.
You're right.
Smiling more.
Goddamn voice down.
Well,
I'll do more than cut your eye out if you don't shut the hell up. Okay, we're gonna get out of here, but you gotta keep low. We shouldn't be too difficult for you.
oh, quite the feckin' comedian, aren't we?
Listen up, asshole.
One thing is made very clear right off the bat with this game. It's on the game cover, on the discs, specifically highlighted in its marketing. Mike and Shadow Man are very different from one another in this game. The first time around, there is no benefit to playing as Mike as opposed to Shadow Man. In both games, since Mike is human, he is open to environmental damage such as falls and drowning, and he cannot access voodoo or shadow powers. In the first game, this makes him a complete downgrade, but this game levels the playing field by giving Mike several advantages, such as greater physical strength, which comes in handy during melee attacks, and allows him to move large blocks and crates, which cannot be moved by Shadow Man. With most of this game being played in live side, you'll be granted several opportunities to play as Mike. He looks much different from the first game, with emphasis placed on his increased physical strength. While his new abilities are appreciated and the block puzzles are nice, you'll probably be having the most fun as the titular alter ego, Shadow Man. In the first game, shortly before the player takes control of Mike for the first time, we hear him speak about the fact that being Shadow Man is not something he particularly enjoys, which is something you also know if you read the comics.
I hate this shit. Just a pawn in Nettie's master plan.
In this game, the character is more accepting of his role and is deliberately portrayed as cocky and arrogant.
I'm going deadside, Nettie. After all, I am the Lord of Deadside, and I need to keep a check on my kingdom.
In fact, he's a giant asshole, and I kinda love it.
Hey, what sort of party was that?
Johnny, it's me. You've been playing with Nettie's makeup again?
Oi, be careful with that thing. You'll have me eye out with it, so you will.
I'll do more than cut your eye out if you don't shut the hell up.
You will catch me, won't you, Michael?
Whoops. Missed. You're Thomas Deacon. So, Thomas, how'd you get to be so vertically challenged?
The Codex.
A book? You lost your legs for a book?
Not just any book.
Wanna come play with me, Shadow Man?
It all depends on what the game is, ugly. Game over. You ugly son of a bitch. You never listen, which is why I'm gonna have to make you listen up, asshole. Talk American, shithead. I ain't got time for a ducky battle. You haven't got any time at all. Says who? Skinny. Says me.
Shadow Man is no longer afraid of or subservient to anyone, including Mama Nettie. Lava and flaming ledges do not play a large role in this game, but there are a few sections where it becomes apparent that he no longer has protection from fire. However, he does not drown or suffer from long drops, and his chest works as a light source, and he can use voodoo and the shadow gun, retaining full shadow power at the start of the game.
Yeah, early days. That was fantastic, and they done pretty well. Shadow Man 2, Second Coming came along.
Red Pepper reprises the role of Shadow Man, who also looks much different this time around. The strategy guide refers to him as a mere skeleton wrapped in muscles and flesh held together by mystical forces. Just look on screen, no need to say more. The redesign is widely criticized by the fan community, but I enjoy it. I think it fits the more cartoony aesthetic of the game. Two other characters with drastic redesigns are Jaunty and Mama Nettie. Barry Mead reprises his role as Jaunty, who retains his humor from the first game, but we see his live side equivalent for the first time and it's laughably goofy. This is his appearance in the comics, but in this game he wears a green suit and a green top hat, and even his dead side serpent form looks weird. I don't like his redesigns at all, but the thing I really don't like is how little screen time we actually get here. Jaunty only gets to have one real conversation, and it is hilarious. I'm glad to hear Barry Mead having a good time, but he is painfully absent for the majority of this game. He says a few words in another cutscene, but he basically serves no purpose aside from opening the Marrow Gates upon completion of a fetch quest. Mama Nettie is entirely different. Brand new appearance, brand new voice, and it sucks. According to the script, there were criticisms about Nettie's original voice, so the actor was recast, and I assume that might have had some kind of influence over her design. This, quote, stunning profile is referenced in the manual and strategy guide as a result of a continued quest for youth. As different as this character is from her first iteration, this change in appearance is actually true to the roots of the series. Agneta, or Anjanetta for comic fans, can manipulate her appearance and inhabit other bodies as she sees fit. There's no nice way to say this, but everything about Nettie sucks in this game. Sure, she's still a powerful voodoo priestess, but this iteration just doesn't do it for me. No disrespect to anyone on a personal level, but this vocal performance is about as enjoyable as accidentally kicking your coffee table barefooted. Anyway, I had mentioned Shadow Man's arrogance earlier, and that plays a role in the dynamic between him and Nettie, as she no longer has complete control over him. Mike and Nettie do not care for one another, and neither are terribly fond of Jaunty, but they realize they don't have a choice but to get over it and work together, and that's basically how I treat having to deal with them while I'm playing this game. There has always been a little friction between these characters, but it's amplified here. Thomas Deacon is a new addition to the roster, kind of. He's the white-haired man from the opening cutscene, a former NYPD cop who now works as a private investigator. He's been working with Nettie for several years, having been the person who provided her with the information on the Five from the first game. He is bound to a wheelchair thanks to his altercation with Samael in the opening cutscene and has a strange fascination with demons.
How did I lose my legs? I got thrown against the wall by a demon called Samael.
Oh yeah, 'cause you're the guy with a demon obsession.
The correct term is Grigory Sephiroth.
There is more than meets the eye with him. Later in the game, he is able to handle an entire group of henchmen on his own, which happens off-screen, and one of the game's bosses outright warns you to not trust the creature that calls itself Deacon. Aside from Shadow Man himself, he is the most important character in the game as he provides you with the knowledge and the tool needed to progress further into the world. The big bad is
Asmodeus.
Their escape from the pit is the main thing you're trying to prevent as Shadow Man. Asmodeus is trapped, and the only way to free them involves the book you see in the opening cutscene, but more on that later. The rest of the characters are dispatched as boss fights in their own respective levels and don't really matter in terms of plot significance aside from blocking progression until they are defeated. However, unlike the Five, none of them feel important, more like one final obligatory challenge at the end of their stage. The opening cutscene shows two NYPD officers chasing a large demon, Samael, into a burning building. They're looking for a very powerful book which is found, but at the cost of the life of one officer and the mobility of another, a man known as Thomas Deacon who makes the escape with the Codex, the book I mentioned earlier. 10 years later, we start off with the training tutorial in Deadside. I always liked this opening sequence, the reuse of the first game's exposition describing Shadow Man and his purpose, which is perfectly timed to the camera moving through the stage, and you see Shadow Man emerge from a circle of skulls. No place like home. It's important to remember that the intro was intended to be completely different, which likely explains the reuse of the exact same voice recording from the first game. Your objective here is to locate your deceased brother Luke's teddy bear, which was lost in the explosion of the asylum at the end of the first game. You could see it within a few seconds, but in typical Shadow Man fashion, there is a bit of exploration required to actually get to it. The level is built in a way that allows you to familiarize yourself with basically all of the game's mechanics. You're given a chance to familiarize yourself with the controls, which have been significantly altered since the first game, for better or worse. You're presented with a group of enemies that you have to fight barehanded, which is a new addition not present in the first game. You learn that R2 and L2 control Shadow Man's hands independently, and he has a wide radius for his attack. He can punch enemies that are in front of, next to, or behind him, granted they're close enough. Certain enemies can be killed with the finishing move if you approach them from behind while they're stunned. Depending on whether you are Mike or Shadow Man, you will break the enemy's neck or rip their heart out. These fights are mandatory as defeating all of the zombies is what unlocks the gate tucked around the corner, and you have to learn how to roll or crouch in order to pass under it. That's a lot to learn in just a few minutes of gameplay, but that's just the beginning. You eventually stumble upon the Marrow Gates, which you cannot open since Jaunty is missing, so you progress another way where you will learn about climbing ladders, swimming, using switches, and grabbing ropes. If you pay attention, you'll also find a present at the bottom of this blood pool. At the end of what is an ultimately short level, you will stumble upon the teddy bear and be able to return to New Orleans. I feel like it's easy to overlook, but this is an incredibly well-made introductory stage. Aside from the combat with weapons, you learn almost everything you'll need to know that will carry you through the rest of the game.
Johnny? What the?
Hey! Welcome home, honey.
What is this shit?
This shit's the beginning of the end. You've seen the sign in the sky. It's a message, Shadow Man. A message from the Boker. Papa Morty. Babylon's gonna fall and you're falling with it.
Let's dance.
Their leader is Bokor Papa Morte, a bitter longtime rival to Nettie who operates from an abandoned house on a plantation that lies just beyond the church. These two have violently clashed in the past, their last encounter leaving Morte with one eye according to the strategy guide. He is breaking his truce with Nettie, which had lasted 8 decades at this point. His henchmen are here to make it known that Morte's ever-expanding cult has outgrown his territory at the plantation and they're taking over. You kick their asses pretty easily and then you're free to explore the bar. This is one of my favorite parts of the game because it borrows heavily from the comics, which features a similar ambush at the Wild at Heart, but again, more on that later. As a fan of the comics and the first game, I really appreciated the opportunity to explore the bar considering we didn't have the opportunity before. Speaking of which, this man does not exist in the German version and blood is green. Anyway, there is something to collect in every room upstairs. You find your first 2 weapons, the nail gun, which is a low damage ranged weapon, and the other a wrecking bar, which can be used for melee combat and to destroy the padlock on the front door. One room contains a map of the entire playable area in Louisiana, and one room contains a curious health pickup. If you allow Shadow Man to urinate by standing in front of the toilet and pressing the circle button, he will regain health. In a game with so much cut content, this is both hilarious and baffling. This is apparent, but is not mentioned yet. Your bar has been ransacked and your possessions have been stolen and your friend was kidnapped.
Johnny.
When you make your way outside, you'll notice that this is actually a pretty sizable location. You can't do much exploring yet, as you do not have the means to remove explosive barrels that currently block several of the entrances into the apartment buildings. Same with a few other barriers you'll come across. You can, however, find a block puzzle at the end of an alley and find another huge block hiding a cadeau. After a bit of running around, you'll find the path out of town and towards your goal. Returning players will recognize the rope and cave that lead to the church, but once you enter, you are introduced to one of the game's biggest differences from its predecessor, Nettie. I've already gone over this earlier, so there's no need to say the same things, but it quickly becomes evident that this is an entirely different character, with the same name. During our first discussion with Nettie, we are gifted with some incredibly campy dialogue. In fact, that applies to almost all of the dialogue in this game, and it feels so terrible that it makes it even more enjoyable than if it didn't come across in such a way. Anyway, during this conversation, you learn the proper pronunciation of Papa Morte, the ringleader of all the lackeys you've murdered so far, and listen to one of the most adorably campy lines ever spoken by Shadow Man.
Well, I reckon I need to go bust a cap in this guy's ass.
You're right, we do.
After this, we begin to search for Jaunty. You then make your way behind the church, where you'll find all kinds of ammunition, enemies, and pickups on your way to locate a dwarf in a green tuxedo hanging upside down from a tree reciting scripture. Yes, that is a sentence that was spoken out loud. After my favorite cutscene in the game, second only to their first encounter in the previous game, you return to the church right before Jaunty completely freaks the fuck out and basically sets the rest of the game in motion. After the conclusion of this cutscene, it's best to hold off on the bird skulls and explore New Orleans with the fire axe and any other weapons you've picked up in the meantime. If you haven't picked up the assassin's rifle, do it now. It's in the small shack that was shown on screen when you found the axe in the basement of the church. You can now destroy barriers that previously prevented you from exploration. Take some time and make sure you pay attention. There are a few crafty hiding spots here. Make sure you explore until you find the shotgun. After this, you'll embark on the most clunky collectathon section I have ever fucking played, where you must collect 10 bird skulls. This begins when you destroy the barrier behind the shack that housed the rifle. I really don't understand why it couldn't just be somewhere between 4 to 6 bird skulls with more obscure birds instead of only a few that are found outside standing at the dock and sniping, which gets really boring really quickly. This is one of the few sections of the game that I completely dread during a playthrough. I suggest sniping all of those punk-ass alligators because you're going to be spending a lot of time underwater, and make sure you explore the building while you're here. Once you've returned to the church, the game really starts to take off. Jaunty's okay for now, but he requires an item known as the chalice. You are given contact information for Thomas Deacon, the former private investigator who provided the information found in Nettie's file in the first game. After a brief phone conversation, you proceed to a cemetery where you must step on a switch located between two angel statues in order to gain access to Deacon's crypt. Here you learn about Papa Morte, the previously mentioned star Wormwood, the sigil, which will serve as this game's equivalent to the Dark Souls, and vital information about the game's main antagonist and their motivations. Emboldened by the appearance of Wormwood, the Seven Grigori want to free their leader Asmodeus so they can fire some sort of laser at the Earth, and that is the star that is being referenced in-game. Yes, you're stopping demons from using their magic spaceship to blow up the Earth. Deacon wants you to collect a sigil and bring it to him, and in order to do this, you will proceed to my favorite section in Louisiana, which is known as the Plantation. Starting with the electric panel maze. After a bit of exploration, you'll enter the Dark Sepulchre. You fight your first abomination before finding the pocket watch and your first sigil. The pocket watch is one of the most important tools in the game and is directly tied to one of the most important changes between this game and its predecessor, as I referenced in the character section. This gives you direct control over whether you play as Mike or Shadow Man, which can be very important depending on the task at hand. After collecting everything here, you return to Deacon and are given one of the most important objects in the entire game, the Codex. This is a book that grants you access to new levels once you have collected all of the sigils from previous ones. The Grigori want this book so that they can open the pit and release their leader. After this, the game opens up, and aside from defeating enemies, not a lot will happen in terms of plot for a while. You'll confront and defeat Papa Morte, who gives you the Shadow Gun, or Mike's gun, during the day. You'll then visit Gehenna, where you'll soon find yourself in the pit, which is basically a hub world very similar to the Cathedral of Pain, and after some puzzles and challenges, you'll be granted more sigils and be able to access Russia. I know my recap so far has more closely resembled a walkthrough than a review, but that ends at this point just due to the nature and pace of the gameplay. You are then free to walk through the gateway between Gehenna and your newly unlocked location. In these sections, you'll complete various puzzles and challenges to unlock sigils, find various items, and progress further into the stages until you eliminate the boss. Russia, for what it's worth, is a beautiful level, and this area is a lot of fun, but I'm not exactly sure how anyone was supposed to figure out that there was an invisible ice bridge connecting you to the other side of the room unless there's something I missed somewhere. Sure, you can pick up a clue from some Steam, but the only hint I noticed is a vague one-liner from Shadow Man remarking how there must be a way out of here. You cannot progress without figuring this out, as you must unlock a door by pulling a lever accessed by crossing said bridge. It's not a big deal, but this leap of faith feels jarring, considering how much of this game requires precise platforming and often punishes your mistakes with lengthy backtracking or death. Something you've surely noticed at this point is that almost every time you perform a context-sensitive action, enemies spawn. Keep this in mind during more of the difficult platforming challenges and stay on your toes. Eventually, you'll make your way to a dilapidated church and enter the Forgotten Ruins. From this point on, you're exploring a winter wonderland in pursuit of Baba Yaga, who will graciously visit you throughout the level. Don't waste your ammo during these encounters, as you will have no effect on her at this time. You'll gain the ability to travel through these fires, collect a few weapons and several Cadeaux. Your objective is to proceed through the mines to the Icy Lake, where you will officially be confronted by Baba Yaga. This is a more straightforward battle, just avoid projectiles and hammer away until she dies. Proceed to collect the remaining sigils and you'll eventually move on to Ireland. First things first, Ireland has a well-known glitch that keeps several textures from properly loading, so basically everything in the entire stage except for character models and certain objects appear to have a black and white polka dot or checkerboard pattern. This makes it a complete nightmare to navigate the Recreant Vault section of this stage. If you look on screen, this is beta footage using a free camera mode in order to give you a better feel for the intended look of the level. I love the medieval feeling of the stage, and the level is so much fun and is very well made. You will find several key items of weapons here, including the chalice, which is needed to save Jaunty. The section you see on screen with the watchtower and the moving platforms is probably my favorite part of any live side location, with the exception of these annoying bridges. Using whichever means you prefer, I suggest damaging the bridges so you will know which boards are safe to walk on. Throughout many sections of the stage, you will be stalked by the level's boss Farduroth. Similar to the last level, except this guy has a far more accurate attack with his crossbow. Don't waste any time trying to fight him, as he cannot be damaged in his current form. Once you make it through a maze of caverns, swimming sections, and switch puzzles, you'll find the lair in which you fight him, who has an interesting gimmick in that his body is invincible and all of the damage must be done from his separated head, which turns out to be its own living creature that can fly around the stage. You unlock one of the greatest weapons in the game in the form of the Malignum, a magic crossbow with infinite ammo and plenty of stopping power. You will then proceed to the greatest section of the game, bar none. The last full level is actually made up of two parts: the Isle of the Dead, which is accessed through Gehenna, and the Boneyard, which lies beyond the Marrow Gates. The Boneyard is where the real magic is, in my opinion. The Well of Blood and its rotating bridge sections leading to the Duppy Village really feels like a true Shadow Man style payoff, something I could have even seen working in the original game. The Duppy Village is so damn fun with so much to do. There are enemies everywhere, levers all over the place, platforms that have to be lifted from the ground, different pathways up and down the mountain, and they all lead to something important. This level gives me the same feeling as some of those in the first game. It's just that good. There are also no sigils in this section. It's all about solving puzzles and collecting new weapons. You definitely have to bring your A-game here and pay attention, which also applies to the Isle of the Dead sections, from the Recreant Vault to the Resting Place. Once you've made it through the entirety of the stage, you'll find the Mutant's Lair, where you'll face off against one of the easiest boss fights in any game I've ever played. Props to the developers for giving the bosses their own gimmicks. This one likes to send lackeys after you instead of fighting you himself, but this is a cakewalk and it doesn't even work consistently. This is like the second or third playthrough that the boss hasn't even reacted to me whatsoever. Aside from the final boss, he's the only one you fight in Deadside, and he's a total pushover. After this, we head to the pit one last time for the final boss, Asmodeus. Instead of entering a Recreant Vault, however, we open the pit itself. Before the fight, we are given one of the most awkward, confusing, and stilted cutscenes in the game. The final version is actually a weird ransom note style cut and paste of an original much longer cutscene that made several references to cut content like the Armor of Angels, a suit you would have gradually collected and assembled throughout the game, and characters that were removed. I mention this because the scene suffers badly from its editing and the decision to cut and paste instead of using another take or writing a new scene, but there's probably some reason why there was no other option here. But basically, you learned that Papa Morte wasn't lying. There is more to Deacon than we knew, which explains how he took out all of those people off screen earlier. He gets his ass kicked pretty quickly, which leads to you defeating the big bad and beheading him after the worst line ever delivered by Shadow Man.
Obviously not. And this is for me.
I'm going to derail this for one moment and draw attention to what I believe is this game's most offensive decision. I'm partly joking. Sure, there's some cartoony elements of the first game and definitely even more with the second, but this game ending with a grown man in whitey-tighty underwear with angel wings flying around a magic rocket ship is dumb as hell. Seriously, Deacon flies around in either a diaper or tidy whities. He deserved to get his ass kicked in one punch. What the hell is this? So what to make of all this? Here's a very bloated conclusion. The first thing I want to discuss is the comic influence. Many plot lines from the comic series are borrowed here, albeit altered. There's always the possibility I missed something, but here's what I noticed. Starting with the opening conflict at the Wild at Heart. In the comic series, a group called the Dead Men come to the bar to confront Zero, aka Mike, as soon as he becomes the new Shadow Man. After having his way with a few of the dead men, Mike is killed by ringleader Tommy Lee Bones, which sends him to Deadside, where Jonty teaches us about who Shadow Man is and what it means to be Shadow Man. During Mike's absence, then owner of the Wild at Heart Josie is bound from the ceiling and interrogated at knife point. Don't feel bad. Josie is a piece of shit. Read the comments to find out why. Anyway, the dead men are confused as to the whereabouts of Mike's body after the murder as it disappeared when he died. He's in Deadside, but no one seems to know this. Shadow Man returns and pretty easily handles the group. Worth noting, the dead men are responsible for the death of the previous Shadow Man, Jack Boniface, and thought they had murdered Nettie. Compare this to the opening of the game. Ambushed by thugs who have a score to settle with Nettie while Shadow Man is in Deadside. There's also a torture victim upstairs. We are given the backstory of Shadow Man's character while in Deadside. One key difference being the dead men are not tied to Papa Morte, who doesn't exist in the comics, but more on that shortly. In the comics, there is an investigation of murders around New Orleans that resemble ritual sacrifice that are directly linked to an evil Bolcor. Shadow Man works with a police detective, future love interest Persephone DeFilo, and eventually tracks down an evil underground society led by Judge Napoleon Lacroix, someone with a bit of a history with Nettie. In the game, you find a ritually slain corpse upstairs in your own bar with symbols painted in blood on the walls. You work with Deacon, who tells you about the symbol and where to find the man behind it, and it's yet another evil Bokor with a history with Nettie, Papa Morte. I'm not exactly sure if Morte and any of the other characters, including Dien, the Grigori from the Iraq stage that was removed, are specifically meant to reference anyone in the comics, but there is a character in the comics named Brute, who shares Haitian accent with Morte, which was implied by Morte's accent and Nettie's mention of his involvement with Baron Samedi, who is the angel of death in the Haitian voodoo religion. Nettie's transformation into her new younger persona could be in reference to a plotline where Nettie permanently inhabits the body of Claudine, a prostitute turned love interest for Michael. There may be more details, but I don't own all of the books yet. I strongly suggest reading them if you are given the chance. I can't speak on the quality of the Valiant character, but Mike Lavoie has a great story and the books can be hilarious. Anyway, back to the game. There are a lot of things that this game does right. In no particular order, let's discuss some of my favorite things.
Oh yeah?
First off, I love the control layout of this game. Second Coming greatly benefits from your movement being controlled by 2 analog sticks simultaneously and the combat being tied to the triggers. You can assign up to 2 weapons per hand depending on whether or not they require using both hands and swap them out with relative ease. There are non-essential weapons and items that you'll miss if you do not explore, such as the grenade launcher. This game is pretty linear. You have several options for how you approach combat, but you'll have to play the game almost the same way each time, so I appreciate getting extra mileage by incentivizing going off the beaten path. The combat system in this game is leagues beyond that of the first, as is the weapon selection. You have several options for both ranged and melee attacks, and can equip several voodoo spells and Nephilim weapons with a variety of uses. Unlike the first game, you can fight barehanded and even have a nice finishing move you can perform on certain stunned enemies. It's not only Shadow Man with increased combat abilities though. The enemies in this game are significantly more dangerous than those of the first. Their ranged attacks travel to Shadow Man much faster, making them more difficult to dodge, and several enemies can actually pick you up and repeatedly slam you on the ground. I can't mention the combat in this game without mentioning the weapon selection, and this might be the game's greatest strength. You have so many options for different weapon combinations, and while they do ultimately achieve the same result, you can still have fun mixing it up and alternating them as you see fit. Each weapon has 2 designs which will suit either Mike or Shadow Man, and while Mike cannot use voodoo, he can use the Nephilim weapons, which allows him to be able to deal the finishing blow to the bosses found in the live side stages. Some of the voodoo items also double as melee weapons for Mike though, so if you're blindsided by a transition between the two, you're not totally out of luck. They're not all winners though. Their grenade launcher really sucks because of its blast radius and the way that explosions work in this game. The nail gun and base pistol are weak, and you'll probably never use melee combat as a first choice, but the weapons are there and I really appreciate that. My favorites are the Shadow Gun, the Malignum, Pest, and Famine. Several times I noticed the game providing me with the means to test my weapons as soon as I found them, like with L'Orage or Mort, which is a nice touch. One of my favorite things about the game, as I mentioned before, is the way you have to choose between Mike and Shadow Man. The duality of the characters is heavily emphasized here, and there are things that require one or the other. I didn't know where else to mention this, but the mouth animations do match up with the English voiceover, but the cutscenes aren't actually in sync with the audio. My absolute favorite thing about this game, however, is the level design. These were clearly designed with a similar philosophy to the first game. There are significantly fewer levels in the sequel, but the ones we have are very well made. They're large levels that require backtracking, and while there aren't as many hidden items scattered throughout them as in the first game, you'll still spend a good amount of time exploring, collecting items, and solving puzzles. My favorite levels are Ireland and the Boneyard. To be more specific, I really enjoy having to solve the various switch and block puzzles in Ireland while being chased by Fardaroth. My favorite part of this level is the area where you raise and lower the platforms in this tower. As far as the Boneyard/Isle of the Dead, while I love the bridges and the waterfall area, the Duppy Village is my favorite. The location itself is a payoff for your exploration beyond the Marrow Gates, revealed after a long puzzle section and rope traversal. The sheer amount of ways to explore, things to collect, and enemies to fight make this section the standout of the game in my opinion. From bottom to top, every pathway leads to somewhere you need to get to at some point, and you need to pay close attention to certain destructible items in the environment that will unlock paths for further progression. This is peak Shadow Man level design, and in my opinion is worth the constant annoyances that can accompany a playthrough. However, the fun times don't last forever, and there are plenty of things holding this game back. I understand that most people don't feel the same way I do about this game, and I understand why, so while it's been a pretty kind review, now we need to discuss the bad things. First off, while I am grateful for the variation of weapons and items, navigating through the master and sub rings is annoying and destroys the pace of the game. It's not horrible, but it's really clunky. This was an issue in the first game, and while the rings are a more sensible option to the original scattershot inventory screen, it becomes very annoying in sections where you only need an item for a split second of use. It's an honest attempt to improve upon a weakness from its predecessor, but it presents so many of its own issues it's hard to say it's better. But to give credit where it's due, multiple weapon slots help to somewhat mitigate some of these issues. Another huge problem is that there are basically no stakes in this game. I'm grateful for the addition of warp points in each stage, but due to the nature of Shadow Man, who does not technically die, this means there's no need to strategize your approach. Just go in guns blazing and respawn if you get your ass kicked. Rinse, repeat. This approach also works during any of the boss battles throughout the game, including the very last one. Granted, you can choose not to play the game like this, but it's weird that in a game about the apocalypse, there's no consequence for Shadow Man failing. Fun fact, originally Shadow Man could be killed by Asmodeus.
Think happens to the undead when they pass on. Well, I'll tell you. Undead get deader. In short, they die.
The mask was going to be ripped from your chest before you were beheaded. The sad fact of the matter is the most dangerous enemy in this game happens to be the physics. I don't believe the controls to be the problem, it's the way that Shadow Man moves. There's no weight to his jump and he feels very slippery. A central focus of your gameplay is platforming, and the physics ruin many of these sections. It's not so bad when you're jumping onto a large platform or there's a ledge that you can't miss, but if you need to be precise, be prepared to hate sections of this game. For example, if one of the bird skulls happened to fall on one of the little lifeboats in Louisiana, forget trying to grab it, just wait for another bird to spawn and hope it falls in the water. There are some control issues. Sure, you'll likely miss a jump here or there because of the physics, but sometimes the game will not register your inputs. I don't know how else to explain it, but every time I play this game, there are several times where I know for a fact I push the jump button, but Shadow Man just runs forward and does not jump. If you are playing on authentic hardware, the load times can be absolutely insane, and the game comes on a blue CD-ROM, which has a tendency to make a PS2 run very loudly. The frame rate can be atrocious, and there's an issue with some of the cutscenes that ruin their pacing. The aforementioned weird glitch that occurs in Ireland, where basically everything except for enemies and a couple items is covered in black and white polka dots. The dialogue leaves much to be desired, Jaunty barely makes an appearance, Nettie sucks, the bird skull mission sucks, and enemies are largely generic and boring. I mean, no disrespect to composer Nick Arundel. I really liked a few of the songs here, but this soundtrack does not fit the apocalyptic setting of the story. However, to be fair, nothing about the presentation of this game matches the dangerous circumstances referenced in the plot, and the worst thing is, there's basically no horror. The first game had an entire presentation that was creepy. The cover of the game features a man holding a human skull with scary creatures appearing on a strange quilt, possibly made out of flesh. The music and sound effects were used to great effect, and the dialogue was kind of intimidating, albeit very campy. The presentation and sense of wonder are what make Shadow Man Shadow Man. The sequel is totally lacking any of that atmosphere save from the color palette and design of the Boneyard. Second Coming feels more in line with Shrek than the original Shadow Man based on the cartoonish presentation, campy dialogue, and some of the soundtrack. The audio mixing can leave much to be desired, particularly with the Kole explosion being entirely too loud. Keep in mind, I myself am a huge fan of Second Coming, but let's continue to be very objective here. Second Coming does not continue the franchise in a satisfactory direction. Even without the closure of its parent studio, I doubt this sequel would have led to the franchise becoming a trilogy. There are several things that this game does better, like combat and overall controls, but the physics, intermittent camera issues, and poor overall performance overshadow everything good about the game. The best example of the tonal clash in this game is your first encounter with Johnny. Shadow Man and Mike look completely out of place here, and the music does not fit. Not to mention, the horror and more mature aspects of the game have been toned down, while the dialogue is filled with more adult content. The boss encounters start to feel like more of the same. There are exclusive gimmicks with each one that require strategy, and for that I commend the development team, but the characters don't mean anything. Again, it just kind of feels like a rinse-repeat sort of deal. Collect some sigils until you fight the boss and you move on to the next. There is still a little bit of backtracking here, but that's not the same as it was the first time around. It's nice to win a boss fight and complete a stage, but it doesn't feel like taking out the 5. Let's actually go back to the good. In the first game, you defeat one of the bosses, and some of them leave behind a prism where you can explore more of the engine block. This is the opposite. You actually explore an area that looks more like Gehenna before emerging into the actual level itself. I think that's really cool. Alright, last but not least, this game is incomplete. There are no two ways about it. There is so much cut content that most of the promotional materials for this game feature elements that aren't even in the published release. Entire characters, 2 entire stages, gameplay mechanics such as Michael being controlled by the player while escorting Jaunty or Deacon, and basically any and all story after the first stretch of the game. Simon Phipps has stated that he was only around long enough to create the script, draw the maps on paper, and record some of the voice work, and that really shows. The continuity between the two games is a little odd, as Shadow Man is granted full shadow power as soon as he recovers his shadow gun, despite us seeing him relinquish all of the Dark Souls. The manual and strategy guide make reference to Shadow Man being more comfortable with his role, so this may canonically increase his shadow powers in another way, but I always found it strange that he retains these powers but dies later if he falls into a pit of fire. He on camera relinquishes all of the shadow power but somehow loses the GAD protection. There was also a reference to Legion. In the first game you'd be forgiven for believing that Legion was the end-all be-all, but it turns out he is simply another one of the Grigori. And I'll just say this here because I couldn't think of anywhere else to put it conveniently, but one of the marketing stunts around this game was called deadvertising. Basically, Acclaim would advertise their game on someone's tombstone to help pay with funeral costs.
Oh yeah?
Whether this was a stunt or not, going so far as to suggest this is a legitimate financial option for poorer families is not a good look, and basically shows exactly where they were at the time, especially since this game opens with a dedication to Angela Atkinson, who was the finance manager for Acclaim Studios' T-side. Unfortunately, caught in the crossfire of all that was one Mike Lavoie. This game was rushed and is missing several items. But if this game is so terrible, why do I still love it, and why did I make an entire video defending it before? In my opinion, it feels just enough like Shadow Man where it counts. I've already mentioned the things I like about this game earlier in this video, so there's no need to rehash, but I still think there is something to enjoy here. Would I love this as much without Shadow Man? No, like I said before, I don't think anyone would even know about it if it wasn't a sequel to Shadow Man. But if you can make it past some of the more questionable decisions and ideas that went into this game, I think you'll enjoy it, especially once you enter Ireland or the Boneyard. This game is generally under $15 if you find it used, and seems to be somewhat common, which is funny because it sold so poorly. But I would check it out if you ever considered yourself a fan of the first game. Don't compare it to the first game and you might enjoy it just a little bit. Just be aware of the fact that it was rushed and is incomplete and is terrible in some ways, but it is endearing. Thank you for watching.